Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Last couple of weeks we've been talking about the nature of God. Of course, that's obviously an important or crucial area to have clear in our minds when we're talking to people about the Christian faith. But then also is this issue that we're going to talk about today, the nature of humanness. There's a lot of confusion in people's minds about what it means to be a human being. And this is really an important subject when it comes to just the relevance of the gospel itself. If we don't understand this subject and understand the biblical teaching on it and able to defend that, it can be very confusing to people. So we want to talk about that today. I have a list of several resources there. Probably the most accessible, the one that would be the easiest to understand, is that second one. Physicalism, Naturalism, and the Nature of Human Persons is a chapter in the apologetic book, To Everyone an Answer. So that's a handy book to have. Deals with a number of different subjects on apologetics, and has this chapter by Moreland on the subject that we're going to be talking about today. At a more advanced level, The Coherence of Theism is a chapter in Moreland and Craig's Philosophical Foundations book. And then Moreland has also written a book with Ray entitled Body and Soul, in which it's a very extensive examination of this whole subject. And then there's actually this book I've mentioned several times before, The Mind and Cosmos by the atheist Thomas Nagel. He actually fairly honestly addresses some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And Anthony Flew also addresses them in his book, There Is a God. And of course, Anthony Flew was the leading atheist, one of the leading atheists of the 20th century, who became a theist shortly before he died, a few years before he died. So those are just some resources in case you need to look at some more material on it. So there are really two major questions about humanness that people wrestle with or they're confused about. And the first one has to do with are we simply material beings, or is there more to us? Are we just physical? Are we a collection of particles and molecules and atoms and that sort of thing? And all of our actions and thoughts and everything about us is animated just simply by the laws of nature, by the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, by electromagnetic principles and laws and that sort of thing. So our actions and our mental processes just the result of those electromagnetic interactions within our physical body? Or, on the other hand, is there something more to us? All right? Is there some non-material aspect to us? Something that is undetectable by science. So science, of course, can detect and measure and examine things related to the physical world, but is there something about us that science doesn't have access to? The second question that we wrestle with, and Kim brought this up at the end of the lesson last week. Are we just animals, or are we more than animals? So are we merely highly developed biological species of some sort? So we're very gifted, we're very advanced, but we are really don't amount to anything much more than just simply animals? Or again, are we unique among living things? Is there something intrinsically unique about us, unique in our essence, that makes us essentially different than all other living organisms? So those are the two main questions. Are we matter or more, and are we just animals? Now, just to really clarify things about what we're talking about today, again, I'll be using the word essence some today. We've talked about what essence is. So essence is the intrinsic nature or indispensable quality of something, a property or group of properties of something without which it would not exist or be what it is. So our essence are those properties which go together, that group of properties which make a particular thing, whether it's us or anything else, the chair or the floor, whatever, what makes it what it is, okay? And there are certain essential things that have to be there. Now, we might have brown hair or blonde hair, we may be tall or short. Those are not essential aspects of what we are, but there are certain things that are essential to being a human being. And everything is, as we've seen, we talked about this before, everything is composed of its own set of characteristics. So everything has its own unique set of characteristics, and that's what we refer to as essence. That's what the Greeks referred to it as essence, and that's what the word essence means. It's a reference to those group of properties that are unique to us, that make us an identify, or make anything for that matter, not just people, but any object or anything, make it what it is. So, and we've talked about this before, that the definition of something. So when I open the dictionary and I'm looking for a definition of the word chair, when I read a definition of the word chair, what the definition does is it expresses the characteristics or the essence by which a thing is identified. So if I read the definition of what is a chair or what is a door, the definition is going to tell me what are those unique characteristics that make a door and not a chair. Okay? So it's the definition is the identity of the thing that we're talking about. The second term that I want us to be familiar with, we'll be using this all day today, is the term physicalism. And the physicalism is the belief that human beings are exclusively physical or material. That's all we are. So we consist solely of what can be described using the language of physics and chemistry. So just by using the language of physics and chemistry, we can completely describe what a human being is. Okay? So that would mean that our cognitive faculties, our mental faculties, include only the brain and the central nervous system. That's all that makes up our mental faculties. So, our neurons, our synapses, our C fibers, just the physical aspect of our nervous system, that's what makes up our mental faculties. And so when a physicalist talks about mind, he's talking about mind as simply the brain or part of the brain, okay? So it's indistinct from the brain, or with some materialists and some physicalists, the mind is seen as what's called epiphenomenal to the brain. So it's something that the brain emits. So the brain emits mind. All right, and so those are two different ways that physicalists look at it. Either the mind is the brain, or the mind is something that just kind of is emitted from the brain, right? So in the first case, if the mind is merely another word for the brain, then all mental states and events are merely physical phenomena in the physical brain. So this is the view of physicalism that sees mind and brain as the same thing. If, on the other hand, the mind is considered to be an epiphenomena of the brain, the states and events of the mind are caused by the brain, but there's no causal relationship going the other way. So in other words, the brain emits the mind, or the mind arises out of the brain as some kind of a phenomena of the brain, or what the brain does. So the brain affects and causes the mind to do what it does, but there's no causal relationship the other way. It's a one-way street from the brain to this kind of epiphenomena of the brain. So this is physicalism. In contrast to that, we have dualism. And in dualism, and as you'll see next week, the word dualism gets used in different ways in different contexts. So we're just talking right now about the discussion of the nature of humanness, all right? So in dualism, it is the belief that the human being is both physical and non-physical. There is clearly a physical part to being human, but there is also an immaterial or a non-physical part, an aspect of us which cannot be detected by science. All right, and typically that non-material aspect of us is referred to. Philosophers usually refer to it as the mind, but we oftentimes refer to it as the soul or the spirit. Okay, so when I use mind or soul and spirit in this discussion, I'm using them interchangeably or synonymously. All right, and as I mentioned. And you have to be alert to this, the word dualism has different meanings in different contexts. So when we're using it in this discussion, it has to do with how I've defined it here. So according to dualism then, the mind is distinct from the physical brain. It's a totally distinct entity from the brain. Now, it may be constantly associated with the brain. It may operate parallel to the brain and operate in connection with the brain all the time, but they are two distinct, in dualism they are seen as two distinct entities. And as I mentioned, it's also associated with the whole idea of the soul or the spirit. So according to dualism then, our cognitive faculties, our mental faculties include two distinct entities. One is the mind, which is non-material, and the second is the brain, which is a material entity and is part of our physical body. Okay? And under dualism, there is a bidirectional causal relationship. So in physicalism, if the mind is seen as an epiphenomena of the brain, there's a one-way causal relationship. The brain causes effects in the mind, but not the other way around. In dualism, that causal relationship operates both ways. The brain can affect the mind, cause events in the mind, but the mind can also cause effects in the brain. So we have these two very distinct views of this very important aspect of humanness. And of course, from what I've described so far, you probably go, okay, the Bible teaches dualism, right? And that is, of course, true. So we have a number of verses. I love this very poetic expression of dualism in Ecclesiastes. He says, remember him, that is God, remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed, the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. So here the golden bowl and the silver cord, that's a reference to the physical body. And he says, before the physical body is destroyed, before the golden bowl is crushed, he says, remember God before this happens. He says, when this happens, he says, then the dust will return to the earth, but there is something about the person that's going to return to God. The spirit will return to God. It's a very clear, distinct picture of two distinct entities in the human person. Jesus said, do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Peter, in his sermon at Pentecost, quoting the Psalms, he says, "Because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay," David prophetically speaking of Christ. And then later in the sermon, Peter says, "He looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay." And so he's talking about two distinct things. He's talking about a part of him that would have gone or might have gone to Hades, he said, and the other part of him which simply would have decayed and rotted and been in the earth. And then in Revelation, John sees the vision. He says, "Then I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the Word of God." So he sees the souls of people whose bodies have obviously been destroyed, right? So throughout Scripture we see this very clear dualistic picture. A picture that there is, to human beings, there is a material aspect and there is this immaterial aspect that goes on and exists even after the body is destroyed and turns to dust and returns to the earth. Okay? So again, talking about the use of the word mind, I just want to clarify a couple things. And one is that oftentimes the word mind is just used in a very generic sense, right? So, for example, I might say, I might say she has a great mind. Okay. Well, if I say that, I'm not necessarily getting into this whole debate about dualism or physicalism. I'm just saying, this individual, is a brilliant thinker or whatever. So oftentimes we use the mind in that very generic sense, and we're not thinking in terms of making a distinction between the mind and the brain. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That there I go again. See, I just did it, didn't I? Keep that in mind that the word mind is probably more often used in this generic sense. But when we get into a technical discussion of physicalism or dualism, mind has a very specific meaning. All right. So in our discussion, as I talk about mind today, I'm talking about it in the sense that I have defined it as this entity, this immaterial entity that is distinct from our brain, and you can think of it, if you prefer to think of it as your soul or your spirit. Okay? So how would we go about if we encounter someone who just thinks, well, that's all I am. I'm just a physical body and I just have a brain and that's all there is to me. How can we go about showing them the truth of dualism? And there are several different arguments that can be made for dualism, but probably the most effective argument, the one that's probably the primary way that we establish dualism, is by use of a particular law or principle that was first expressed by this guy Leibniz, who was a German mathematician, philosopher, scientist in the 18th, 17th century. And he had what he called the law of the indiscernibility of identicals. Okay, that's a big name. Okay, but when you think about it, what he's talking about the law that identicals can't be discerned from one another. Okay, so it's the law of the indiscernibility of identicals, and basically what the law says is, if you're thinking about truly identical things, okay, if they're really truly identical, if they're exactly alike in every single aspect, in every single way, you're not talking about two things. You're talking about one thing, okay? So that's the law of the indiscernibility of identicals. So, for example, say sometime in the future you pick up a history book and you're reading about this great, phenomenal historical figure, Rick Harvey, okay, and he's accomplished all these remarkable things. And then again, at another time you're reading about some guy Fred Harvey's youngest son. Okay? Well, how would you know if Fred Harvey's youngest son was the same person, Rick Harvey, or if they were different? Okay? How would you be able to know that? And the way you would be able to know it would be if you could detect or find one thing, just one thing that was different about Fred Harvey's youngest son and Rick Harvey, whatever that one thing might be. If you could just find one thing that was different, according to the law of the indiscernibility of identicals, you would know they're two different people. So you're reading about Rick Harvey and you're reading about Fred Harvey's youngest son, and they seem like the same people, except you find out that Rick Harvey preferred cherry pie and Fred Harvey's youngest son preferred pumpkin pie. Okay? That's just one thing. But that would be enough to tell you that they're two different people. Okay? So this principle then works in a number of different areas. So the two are really the same person if, and only if, they are completely identical in every way. Right? Does that make sense? So this chair, if I'm talking about a chair, and I'm describing a chair, and I'm describing it as located in this position, and a number of things about it, and then I'm talking about again a chair, and it turns out that it's exactly like this chair, but it's in a different position. Then I know they're not the same chair, right? And so what I want to stress is you don't have to have a whole list of ways in which two things are different. You only need one, right? So we can apply this principle then when we try to think about the mind and the brain and try to determine whether or not they're the same thing or whether or not they're different. So I only need to discover a single difference between the brain and the mind, all right, in order to establish dualism. If I can just find one difference between the brain and the mind, then I will know that they are two different entities, okay? So the way Moreland and Craig put it is they say, to establish physicalism, it is not enough that mental states and brain states are causally related or constantly conjoined with each other in an embodied person. So what they're addressing here in this first sentence is sometimes the argument is, well, the brain and the mind are always together, and they have causal relation, and so they're the same thing, okay? But what they're saying here is, no, that's not enough. That's not enough to establish physicalism. Physicalism needs identity to make its case. And if something is true, or even possibly true, of a mental substance, property, or event that is not true or possibly true of a physical substance, property, or event, physicalism is false. So they're basically just saying, you know, what we've just said. All we have to do is just find one thing, and just the fact that they're always associated together doesn't mean they're the same thing. My wife and I are married. We go everywhere together and we do things together. That doesn't make us the same person, right? So just being causally related or even locationally related doesn't make it the same, okay? So physicalism is falsified, and dualism is established if you can find just one thing in which the brain and the mind are different, or the functions of the brain and the functions of the mind are different. So that's what I'd like to set out to do here, just using this and this is just the first of three arguments we're going to talk about today. The argument from Leibniz's law. And it turns out that there are several different things that when we look at, we go, well, they look like they're really different, okay? And the first is that mental events have what we call self-presenting properties, okay? So events of the mind have this really curious aspect of self-presenting properties. What do we mean? Well, things like our thoughts, or our sensations, our beliefs, our desires, our preferences, even freedom of choice. Okay, these are all things that we say are self-presenting. And what we mean by that is they're presented directly to the subject. He or she has them immediately through introspection, okay, without another mental state. So I'm just aware of what I believe. It just immediately presents itself to me. Or if I'm feeling pain, I'm just immediately aware of that. Okay, that's just a sensation. Or if I'm seeing something, if I'm seeing a tree, I'm just immediately aware of that. I have this immediate kind of sense of that without some kind of other kind of process necessary for me to do that. So, for example, there's this pink elephant in the room, right? We've got this pink elephant, okay? So now I've got you all thinking about a pink elephant, but there's no pink elephant here, right? You haven't seen a pink elephant. There is no physical object, but you are conceiving of a pink elephant, right? That's a thought that just immediately presents itself to your mind without actually seeing a pink elephant, okay? So this would be a self-presenting property that your mind has that can't be explained through simply physical processes. So physical properties, on the other hand, are not self-presenting. They are instead mediated to us. So the chair here is the reality of the chair is mediated to me by light waves coming into my brain, right? Into my eyes, and then being sent by impulses to the brain. But how is it that in the brain, where those impulses are going on, how is it that I actually know that that is a chair and exactly what it looks like and how it's shaped and where it is? How do I know that? How is that translated from electrical impulses to my immediate awareness of the chair? Okay, that's the puzzle that physicalism cannot resolve. Another thing about these self-presenting properties is that we have private access to them. All right, so there's no one else who can access these self-presenting properties that I have. All right, so I can go into a laboratory, and a scientist can hook up all kinds of, sensors and whatever to my brain and to my body, and he can tell when my brain is doing things, right? He can see these electrical impulses going, and so, but he can't tell that I'm praying, right? He can't tell that I'm thinking about a piece of cherry pie. He can't tell that whether or not I'm happy or sad about the outcome of yesterday's football game, right? He can't tell those things. He can tell there's activity, but he can't tell what I'm thinking, right? So I have private access to something that's going on in my cognitive process. I have a private access to that is not and cannot be accessible to anybody else unless I tell them, right? On the other hand, physical properties and events are, in principle, publicly accessible. So, as I said, a scientist can tell when these electrical impulses are going on in my brain. He can tell that whether my brain is functioning or my brain is not functioning. So he has, in some sense, public access. Other people have access to the activities within my brain, but nobody has access to those private thoughts that I have. a beautiful verse there in Proverbs. He says, "The heart knows its own sorrow, and a stranger does not share its joy." So there's that element of sorrow or joy. Now, I may express it outwardly through tears or laughter, right? And then people would go, "Oh, well, he's happy or he's sad." But unless I express it outwardly, there's no way anyone can have access to that information. I have private access to it. So again, Marlon and Craig, one can be aware of the external physical world only by means of one's mental states, but one need not be aware of one's mental states by means of anything else. Okay? So there's that idea of private access. And then there's the quality of incorrigibility. And this is just the idea that whether or not you can be wrong about something, all right? And it appears that a person is incapable of being mistaken about their mental property, okay? What do we mean by that? So I'm driving down the highway, and it's a sunny day, and I look down the highway, and I see on the highway there's some water on the highway, right? And I have the perception of water on the highway. But as I drive on, that puddle of water moves on down the road, right? It's a mirage, okay? So I am mistaken about there being water. But it appears that there's something that I can't be mistaken about, and that's that I'm having the sense of seeing water. Okay? So there's something about our mental qualities that are incorrigible, that I can't be mistaken about. All right? So if I am feeling pain, I'm having that sense of feeling pain, and I can't be mistaken about the fact that I'm feeling pain. Now, I may not have, I may be a hypochondriac, and I'm thinking about pain, but there's nothing really going wrong with my body. But I can't be mistaken about the fact that I'm having the sense of feeling pain. I may have a hallucination, and I could be mistaken that there's nobody there and I'm hallucinating. But it's not apparent that I can be mistaken that I'm having that sense that I'm seeing someone. Okay. So there's this element of incorrigibility. Thirdly, there is what we call first-person perspective. So you have a first-person perspective about things in your life and about things you're thinking and things that are going on that nobody else can have. This goes back to this idea of private access a little bit, okay? So according to physicalism, there are no irreducible privileged first-person perspectives. So according to physicalism then, somebody could theoretically just fully and completely describe you, all right? Using various terms and various concepts like how tall you are and how much you weigh and all about your atoms and your molecules and the electrical impulses, and all those things could be described by you, right? But could be described about you by someone else, supposedly, who had access to all those physical aspects about you. But there are some things for which you have a first-person perspective that they don't have. So a description of you by someone described you, completely described you, and described everything about you physically, down to your atoms and your neutrons and all that sort of thing. Even if they did that, there would be things that they were unable to describe about you, all right? So things about what you prefer, what you believe, what you like, what you don't like, those things they would not be able to describe. Your feelings or your thoughts about something that happened a long time in the past. So you think back on something that happened in such and such a date, and you have thoughts about that. There's no way that anybody else, by fully describing you, would be able, from their perspective, to be able to describe your thoughts and your feelings from that date back in the past, okay? So that's what's called first-person perspective. The fourth one is ongoing personal identity over time. I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but I've thought about this a lot of times. Even before I studied this subject, it was fascinating to me that here I am today. I'm standing here in this classroom. I'm an adult. I'm a grandfather. I've lived a number of years. I'm standing here teaching a class on Christian apologetics. But I have a very deep awareness, a sense that I am the same person who at 13 years of age used to fish in the sand pit down south of town there in that little town in Nebraska. I'm the same person. And I have a very deep sense of being the same person. I have a very deep sense of being the same person, that 7-year-old kid who climbed up on the garage roof, right? And so I think about, and as I think about that, I think that was me. That wasn't somebody else. Now, I'm completely different. I'm, you know, my molecules, you know, except for possibly a few cells in the brain, I am completely different physically, all right? And I am much older, and yet there's something about me that I go, I am the same person. I'm the same person who had such and such experience at such and such a time, right? So I have this ongoing identity over time. So, as I put it here, it seems a person can maintain absolute sameness through change. And this is what we call personal identity. I am the same self-aware person who, as I said, fished in the sand pit or climbed on the garage roof when I was a kid, right? So even given radical physical change over time, a person remains essentially the same self-aware person. It's a fascinating thought to me, and I've thought about it many times. And then fifth is free will. A person can choose whether or not to act or how to act. He or she is the ultimate originator of his or her actions. Now, there are, of course, people who deny this. There are people who say, no, we're completely different. Particularly physicalists will argue, well, no, everything is determined. You don't have a free will. But the fact is, ultimately, nobody believes that. Because everybody lives their lives every day as though they had free will, right? And they make decisions and they make choices and they believe they do have some element of freedom, right? So we have this very deep sense of being free and able to choose. Why do we have that sense if we are strictly physical? Because physicalism implies determinism. Under physicalism, everything is determined by the laws of nature, by the laws of physics and chemistry and electromagnetic principles and that sort of thing. So everything is determined by those laws. So I really don't have a choice. I don't have freedom, right? So free will, of course, is necessary for the whole idea of moral obligation. If you don't have freedom, you can't have moral obligation. So if I believe that in fact people have morally free choices and they're to be held morally accountable for the choices they make, if I do believe that, then I'm acknowledging that there's something about me that's not strictly physical, because physical things are all determined, right? So those are all various arguments from Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. And what I want to mention again, I've already said this, but I want to stress it. Of those 5 that we mentioned, and you might go, okay, that one I can see, I'm not sure about this one. That's fine. You don't need all 5 of them, or 4 of them, or 3 of them, or 2 of them. You only need one of those to establish that there is a difference between the mind and the brain, okay? Then there's a couple other arguments that we just take a little bit of time to look at. One is consciousness, and we've talked a lot about consciousness already in earlier lessons, and we've talked about how consciousness is, at least at a minimum, is an awareness of the world, of ourselves and the world around us, and that sort of thing. And again, as human beings, we're not only conscious, but we are conscious that we're conscious, and we're not only conscious that we're conscious, but we wonder and think about the significance of being conscious of our consciousness, right? So this is a very puzzling thing because there's no material explanation for consciousness. And this becomes even obvious when you start reading the writings of various atheists. So for example, there's Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a militant atheist, okay? He's a very aggressive atheist and a philosopher. But he says this regarding the whole physicalist aspect. He says, the problem, however, is that nothing about a brain, when surveyed as a physical system, declares it to be a bearer of that peculiar interior dimension that each of us experiences as consciousness in his own case. He says we don't have any kind of way to explain consciousness if we're just looking at the brain as a strictly physical object. And then again, Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, in which he argues against the neo-Darwinist view of evolution, because again, he says, it cannot account for consciousness, cognition, and values. So even atheist writers recognize the problem with physicalism is that it cannot account for this element of consciousness, which of course dualism can very easily explain. And then the third problem with physicalism is it's self-refuting. In that if cognition is the product of accidental mutations and natural selection, so you have these accidental mutations and then you have natural selection working on those mutations to select those which are which enhance survivability, right? So that's the whole principle. You have these mutations, some of them are detrimental, but some of them are helpful supposedly to survival, and natural selection chooses the ones that are helpful and ingrains those into the system, all right? But all of that is the product of these accidental mutations, whether they're good or bad, right? But physicalism, I said, because of that, implies determinism. So according to physicalism, our minds are determined to think what they think. So I've got a physicalist here and I've got a dualist here, and the physicalist says, well, I'm determined to believe what I believe. My mind is predetermined by the laws of nature to do what it does. And the problem is that if that's true, he's been determined that, and we'll explore this more when we get in our science module, he's determined to think that way, that physicalism is true simply by the laws of nature and because it somehow enhances his survivability, right? So in other words, he believes that physicalism is true not because it is true, but because his belief in it enhances survivability. Okay? So in other words, he has no confidence that evolution has produced in his mind a mind that searches for truth. It's only produced a mind that enhances survivability. And it's possible to have a belief that's not true that enhances survivability. So you got a rabbit out in the field and he's kind of hopping along nice and merry, and he sees a dog coming after him, okay? And the rabbit goes, oh, this dog wants to play. He wants to play tag, so I'm going to run, okay? So he runs and he survives. And every time he sees a dog, he runs and he survives, okay? Or he could go, oh, that dog wants to eat me. And so he runs and he survives. Okay? In either case, what he believes enhances his survivability, but it's not associated with truth. It's associated with whether or not it enhances his survivability. And this is the problem that physicalism presents. So what that means is that physicalism undermines its own argument to be true because I'm a physicalist. If I am a physicalist, because I've been determined to be a physicalist, not because physicalism is true. Okay? So it is in fact a self-refuting argument. Okay? So on this whole subject, David Berlinski has this, I think, really interesting quote. He's got a really remarkable way of writing. The guy, incidentally, is not a Christian. He's actually a secular Jew. He's a brilliant mind. He actually works with the Discovery Institute. He's a fellow at the Discovery Institute. But he's fun to read, and he's got a really dry wit. But at any rate, he says this: although I may be struck by a thought, or moved by a memory, or distracted by a craving, these familiar descriptions suggest an effect with no obvious physical cause. Thoughts, memories, cravings, they are what? Crossing space and time effortlessly, the human mind deliberates, reckons, assesses, and totes things up. It reacts, registers, reflects, and responds. In some cases, like inattention or carelessness, it invites censure by doing nothing at all or doing something in the wrong way. In other cases, like vision, it acts unhesitatingly and without reflection. And in still other cases, the human mind manages both to slip itself into and stay aloof from great causal stream that makes the real world boom. So that when it gives the go-ahead, what I do is, as Thomas Aquinas observed, inclined but not compelled. These are not properties commonly found in the physical world. They are, in fact, not found at all. Okay? And so it's just a beautiful way of illustrating this distinction between this immaterial, what may be to us somewhat mysterious element of our being, and the physical aspect. Okay? Well, if these are arguments for dualism, how does the physicalist respond? How does he attempt to refute dualism? And he has three kind of main arguments that you'll typically get. And one is that the physicalist will say, well, you say that the mind is causing the brain to do things, but you can't explain that causal relationship. You can't explain how an immaterial thing can affect or bring about events in the material world. You can't explain that. And so therefore, the immaterial world doesn't exist. Okay? What's the problem with that argument? Remember, the last couple of weeks we talked about the completist fallacy. Okay, so the completist fallacy is again the fallacy that says that in order to explain something, you have to be able to explain the explanation, right? And we saw that that leads to an infinite regress of explanations, and so you never could have an explanation for anything. All right. And so this argument by the physicalist is simply committing that completist fallacy. The fact is that we oftentimes explain things as the cause of something else when we don't know how that happens. So even in the physical world, how does a magnetic field move a material object? We don't know. Or again, how does one planet attract another planet using gravity? We don't even know what gravity is. So we can't explain how one planet has an attraction to another planet millions of miles away via gravity. So we can't explain how it does that, and yet we know it does, right? And what's interesting here is these are entirely two different entities. So you have a planet, which is a material spatial object, right? And then you have gravity, which is, not spatial. It is material in some sense, but not in the sense that we think of being atoms and molecules and that sort of thing. It's some kind of a force. So you have a force, and somehow that force has an effect on a material object. How does that happen? How does that work? We don't know. Right? We can't explain it. And yet we know it does, right? So this argument fails because it is the completist fallacy. The second argument that they oftentimes make is that physicalism is based on scientific assumptions, all right? So it actually provides a complete picture of reality because it explains everything scientifically, and so it gives us a complete picture. We don't need dualism because physicalism explains everything. But of course the assumption that's being made here is that since humans are the product of an entirely physical process, utilizing only physical materials, okay, then humans can only be physical. So that's the assumption that's being made. But in reality, what you have here is the fallacy of begging the question, or circular reasoning, right? Because the argument is committing the fallacy of assuming what it's seeking to prove. It's assuming that all of reality can be explained by material causes in order to defeat the argument that there are non-material causes. But it's assuming what it's seeking to prove, so it is a circular argument. And then the third argument that's often made is it's an appeal to simplicity, or Occam's razor. And again, Occam's razor is the principle that if you have two competing hypotheses that are equal in every other respect, the simplest explanation is the preferred explanation. Okay, and when we studied argumentation and how we make arguments, and we talked about inference to the best explanation, we talked about Occam's razor and simplicity as one of the criteria that we use in evaluating various hypotheses or explanations. Okay. And so the argument here is physicalism is more simple because it only proposes one thing, whereas dualism is more complex because it proposes that there are actually two entities. So physicalism is the simpler explanation. But it's assuming a couple things. One, it's assuming that Occam's razor is the only criteria, or that Occam's razor is the primary criteria for evaluating competing hypotheses. But it's not. It's not the only criteria, and it's certainly not even the primary criteria. It's just one of several criteria. There are other criteria. So when the physicalist argues chiefly from simplicity, he's ignoring these other criteria, things like explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, and things like that. In addition, he's making the claim that physicalism fully explains the phenomena. But we've just seen, when we went through Leibniz's law, we've just seen 5 points that physicalism can't explain, or has a great deal of difficulty explaining, that dualism explains better. So while dualism is, in one sense, a somewhat more complex explanation, it also has more explanatory scope, more explanatory power, more plausibility, etc. Okay, so this argument also fails. Okay, so in the time we have left, then I want to address the second question. So the first question is, are we merely physical beings, or do we have a spiritual, non-material aspect to us? The second issue that we run into, and you encounter this a lot today, you encounter it with radical environmentalists and all kinds of situations you encounter with people, is that human beings are not unique in nature, that we are just another animal, okay? We are admittedly more supposedly advanced in many ways and more gifted, but we are just another animal. And this, of course, comes in part, or is certainly supported by this idea that we are simply the products of Darwinian evolution, or neo-Darwinism. Okay, so we are really, when it comes down to it, we're really of no greater intrinsic significance or value. The only thing that makes us more significant than the other animals is we're just more advanced than they are. But other than that, we really have no other value or no other significance than does any other living organism. And in fact, because there's so many of us, and because of the way we behave, human beings are seen as being a burden on the environment. So we are actually a burden on the environment. We actually provide a hindrance to the rest of the biosphere, if you want to call it that. All right. So that leads then, with some, not all, but that leads then to the conclusion that it would be best for the totality of biological life, it'd be better for the world if there were fewer humans on it. All right? And so this leads to things like population control, euthanasia, abortion, and things like that. Okay? So these are very common views that we encounter today. So are we different? Of course, biblically, very clearly we are. God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, he created him. So there's this very clear teaching throughout Scripture that as human beings we have, in some sense, the image of God that no other living thing has. All right? James bears that out too. In James he says, men who have been made in the likeness of God. He's making an argument there about how we ought to treat our fellow man. And so the point is, this imago Dei, this image of God, continues even after the fall. So James is, of course, writing millennia after the fall, and he says we still possess that imago Dei. So what that means is, because we possess the imago Dei, we are in our essence distinct from other living creatures. As spectacular as many other living creatures are, we have something that is essentially us, that makes us what we are, that is unique and different from all other living beings. So we're essentially greater and of more value. So that then implies certain things, and Scripture brings these out. One, man is to rule over the creation. Secondly, man is to benefit from creation. Creation is made for our benefit. We are to utilize, cultivate, and benefit from the creation. Thirdly, because of our being in the imago Dei and our creative potential and things like that, more humans leads to a better world. So the idea behind the population control movement today is we need to reduce the number of humans. The biblical teaching is that more humans lead to a better world. And I could spend about 3 or 4 lessons just on that one point alone to prove that point, but we need to go on. So we're to rule and subdue the creation, and the fact that man sins and that man abuses the creation is not evidence that he is not different or distinct or unique from the creation. So just the fact that we do, in fact, at times pollute and do things that are destructive to the creation doesn't negate the fact of our essential uniqueness. In fact, I would argue that it actually points towards our uniqueness. In addition, only humans are, as we said, conscious and conscious that we're conscious. We alone contemplate our own nature and its significance. We alone contemplate beauty and disorder. We alone possess the capacity to rule over creation and to enhance the created order through cultivation and husbandry. This is the thing that's fascinating to me, is the creation is out there and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing the way God created it, but He Himself tells us that we can improve it. That we can, through husbandry, through cultivation, we can actually take the creation and make it better for human flourishing. Okay? So God gave us, in one sense, the raw materials, but we as human beings, in a way that's unique from all other living beings, have the potential, particularly when we're working together with other human beings with minds, when we're working together with them to enhance the creation through various means. Okay? We alone have a sense of the divine, an inclination to worship, and a sense of obligation. So these are ways in which we as human beings are unique. And I'll give you a handout there with a list of a number of other ways in which we as human beings are unique and distinct from the creation. Okay, so next week we're going to start a 3-week session on the problem of evil and suffering. We're still in our philosophy module. But the problem of evil is the biggest problem people have with Christianity, with the Christian faith, with the idea of there being a God. And so we need to be really equipped to handle it. Because people struggle with it not only on an intellectual level, but they struggle with it at a very deep emotional level as well. And so it's something that we really need to get a handle on, because this is really the primary, one of the primary objections to theism. But I should mention as well that the problem of evil is a problem for every worldview. Every worldview has to be able to answer this problem. So the question is, how do we as Christians answer the problem of evil and suffering? And so we'll start on that next week. So any comments or questions? That was like a lot of stuff in a hard to grasp in just a short bit of time. But okay, all right, see you next week.